Beheaded at Ocracoke. Edward Teach, known to his ear as Blackbeard, met his end on the morning of November 22nd, 1718, on the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet, off the coast of the province of North Carolina. He had been operating in the Carolina Sounds for some time, and his presence there was not entirely unwelcome to certain colonial officials. The arrangement suited him. The inlet was remote, navigable to those who knew it, and difficult for outsiders to approach without running aground. Blackbeard knew the sandbars. His enemies did not. Governor Alexander Spotswood of Virginia had grown tired of waiting for North Carolina to act. He organized a naval expedition himself without notifying the neighboring colony. He commissioned Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy to lead 2 small hired sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, into the inlet and find Blackbeard's vessel, the Adventure. The operation was unauthorized across colonial lines. Spotswood funded part of it privately. He wanted Blackbeard dead or captured regardless of jurisdictional protocol. Maynard's sloops entered the inlet on the night of November 21st. They held position overnight. Blackbeard had roughly a dozen men aboard the Adventure. By some accounts, he had sent a portion of his crew ashore. The night passed without incident. The morning of November 22nd came clear. Maynard began moving toward the Adventure at first light. The inlet was treacherous. Maynard's lead sloop ran onto a sandbar almost immediately. The Jane ground to a halt in the shallows and could not maneuver. Blackbeard had time. He brought the Adventure around and fired a broadside at close range. The effect was severe. A significant number of Maynard's men were killed or wounded in that single volley. The Ranger, the second sloop, was damaged enough that it dropped out of engagement. Maynard was now operating with a single vessel, heavily reduced in crew and still partially grounded. Maynard ordered the surviving men below decks. From the Adventure, the Jane appeared nearly finished. The decks looked empty. Blackbeard brought his vessel alongside. He led a boarding party across himself. Maynard's men came up from below. The fighting began at extremely close range and did not stop. There was no room for maneuver and no distance between the combatants. Blackbeard and Maynard fought directly. Period accounts recorded that Blackbeard was shot during the engagement and continued fighting. He was shot again. He continued. Contemporary narratives described him sustaining multiple gunshot wounds and a large number of sword cuts before he finally fell on the deck of Maynard's sloop. Whereas these accounts come from period testimony and naval records of the time, not forensic documentation, and the precise numbers they report should be understood as such. He fell on the deck of the Jane. In the water around the sloops, the rest of the fighting ended. Blackbeard's boarding party was killed or surrendered. His crew still aboard the Adventure was taken. Maynard had Blackbeard's head severed and hung from the bowsprit of his sloop. His body was thrown into the inlet. The surviving members of Blackbeard's crew were transported, tried, and the majority of them hanged. Maynard sailed back toward Virginia with the head still hanging from the bow. Edward Teach died on November 22nd, 1718, on the deck of Lieutenant Maynard's sloop at Ocracoke Inlet. Cause of death: multiple gunshot wounds and edged weapon injuries sustained in close quarters combat. He was approximately 38 years old. His body was thrown into the water and never recovered. Hanged twice over. William Kidd, known in his time and long after as Captain Kidd, was brought to Execution Dock in Wapping, London on May 23, 1701, to be hanged by the neck until dead. He had not always been a pirate, or at least had not always been considered one. Kidd had been a privateer, a ship captain commissioned by authority to attack enemy vessels in the name of the Crown. King William III had backed his voyage. Powerful investors had funded it. He had sailed from England in 1696 aboard the Adventure galley with a letter of marque that authorized him to take French ships and attack known pirates. The voyage was legitimate at its outset. What happened next made him a test case for the legal and political tensions of an era in which the line between privateer and pirate was frequently a matter of who was asking and what they stood to gain. On the voyage, Kidd killed his own gunner, a man named William Moore, during a dispute aboard ship. The method was a wooden bucket. Moore died the following day. Kidd also captured a vessel called the Quedagh Merchant, a large Armenian-owned ship sailing under a French pass. He argued that the French pass made the vessel a legitimate prize under his commission. His backers in England, by the time he returned, no longer wanted to be associated with him. The political climate had shifted. His investors wanted distance. He was arrested when he returned to colonial America. He was shipped to England. He was held in Newgate Prison, which was not a comfortable place to wait for anything. His trial moved quickly. The French pass that he claimed would justify the Quedagh Merchant capture was not produced at trial. He was convicted of the murder of William Moore and of 5 counts of piracy. The trial was considered politically motivated by many contemporaries. That consideration did not affect the sentence. On May 23, 1701, William Kidd was walked to Execution Dock. Execution Dock was the designated site for maritime executions, positioned deliberately at the edge of the Thames so that the tidal water would wash over the body of the hanged man after death. It had been used for this purpose for centuries. Every sailor who passed through the river could see what happened to pirates there. The first rope broke, Kidd fell. He was not dead. He was standing, or something close to it. The rope had failed on the first drop. He was stood up. A second rope was fitted. The second hanging was carried out. It succeeded. His body was then prepared for display. A pre-fitted iron gibbet cage, a framework of metal bars shaped to hold a corpse upright, was used to mount his remains. The gibbet was hung at Tilbury Point on the Thames, positioned at the river's entrance where it could be seen by every vessel coming into or leaving the waterway. It remained there for approximately 3 years. Every ship entering the Thames during that period passed it. Every sailor making for London saw it. The Crown's message required no narration. William Kidd was pronounced dead on May 23, 1701, at Execution Dock, Wapping, London. Cause of death, judicial hanging. He was approximately 56 years old. His iron cage body hung over the Thames for approximately 3 years before it was taken down. Drunk, then dead. Bartholomew Roberts, known to his contemporaries as Black Bart, died on the morning of February 10, 1722, off Cape Lopez on the coast of present-day Gabon, West Africa, struck by grape shot before he had time to mount a meaningful defense. Roberts was, by any accounting of the historical record, one of the most successful pirates who ever operated. Over a career that lasted roughly 3 years, he captured an estimated 400 or more vessels across the Atlantic and Caribbean. He was meticulous, disciplined, and well organized by the standards of his profession. He maintained a code of conduct aboard his ships. He dressed carefully. Contemporary accounts noted that he wore fine clothing in battle as a matter of deliberate style. He chose his targets with calculation, and he evaded Royal Navy pursuit across multiple ocean crossings. By the time of his final anchorage at Cape Lopez, Roberts commanded the Royal Fortune, a powerful frigate-built vessel he had captured from the Royal Africa Company some months prior under the name Onslow, and converted to serve as his flagship. She was well armed and formidable, a ship that reflected the scale of his operation at its height. On the night of February 9, 1722, Roberts' fleet was anchored off Cape Lopez. His men had been celebrating recent prize-taking, and the consumption of alcohol during that evening was, by period accounts, significant enough to render much of the crew impaired by the following morning. Roberts himself had reportedly been drinking as well. These accounts come from period sources and are consistent across multiple records of the engagement. HMS Swallow, a Royal Navy warship under Captain Challoner Ogle, had been hunting Roberts for some time. Ogle had located Cape Lopez before, but had been drawn away by a decoy vessel and turned back. On the morning of February 10th, Swallow returned. She came in quietly enough that the initial alarm from Roberts' fleet was misread. One of his consort vessels initially sailed out toward the Swallow, thinking it might be a merchant ship. Ogle dealt with that vessel separately, and then turned back toward Roberts' flagship, the Royal Fortune. When the Royal Fortune's crew understood what was approaching, their condition worked against them. Many were not in a state to fight effectively. Roberts was on deck. He was, by the accounts of what followed, trying to organize his ship to meet the threat. Swallow came into range. She opened fire. A grape shot round struck Roberts in the throat. Grape shot was a cluster munition, a canvas bag or iron container packed with smaller iron balls, designed to scatter at close range and tear through personnel on an open deck. At the distance Swallow had achieved, it was what the guns were loaded for. Roberts died on the deck of the Royal Fortune. Whether he died immediately or within moments of being struck is not established in the surviving record with precision. His crew recognized he was dead. Roberts had reportedly given standing orders on this specific contingency. He did not want his body taken by the Navy. His crew took him, wrapped his body in his sail, and threw him into the sea before Swallow could board. Swallow boarded the Royal Fortune. The surviving crew, many of them still in poor condition from the night before, were taken. They were transported to Cape Corso Castle on the Gold Coast for trial. The proceedings resulted in 54 men hanged. Others were imprisoned or sentenced to hard labor in the African trading forts. Captain Challoner Ogle returned to England. He was knighted. He was the only Royal Navy officer in the entire era specifically knighted for actions taken against pirates. Bartholomew Roberts died on February 10th, 1722, off Cape Lopez, West Africa. Cause of death: grape shot wound to the throat. He was approximately 39 to 40 years old. His body was thrown into the sea before the Navy could board and has never been recovered. Governor's Gallows. John Rackham, known by the name Calico Jack for the calico clothing he favored, was captured in October 1720, while his crew slept and was hanged at Port Royal, Jamaica on November 18, 1720. Rackham had taken a privateer's pardon under the Act of Grace earlier, and had, for a period, set aside piracy. The pardon did not hold. He returned to the sea and to raiding, operating in the Caribbean aboard a sloop called the William. His crew was not large, and the William was not a major vessel by the standards of the time, but they had been active enough to draw the attention of the governor of Jamaica. In October 1720, Rackham's sloop was anchored off the western coast of Jamaica. The crew had been celebrating a recent prize, a vessel under the command of Captain Jonathan Barnett, commissioned by the governor of Jamaica to pursue pirates in the area, located the William. It was night. Barnett's vessel came alongside. What Barnett found was a vessel whose crew was, for the most part, below decks, and in no condition to fight. Testimony recorded at the subsequent trial established that the men were largely intoxicated. Two women who were aboard the William, Anne Bonny and Mary Red, were among those who reportedly continued to resist after the men had effectively stood down. The men were taken without significant combat. Rackham and his crew were brought to Spanish Town, Jamaica, for trial. The proceedings were brief. His record was established and his identity was not in question. He was convicted. He was transported to Port Royal for execution. He was hanged at Port Royal on November 18th, 1720. A general history of the pirates, published in 1724 by the author known as Captain Charles Johnson, recorded that Anne Bonny was permitted a brief visit with Rackham before his execution. According to that period account, she reportedly told him that, had he fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. The account is from a period source of debated complete reliability, and is recorded here as Bonny's reported words, not as a confirmed verbatim exchange. After Rackham was hanged, his body was placed in an iron gibbet and displayed at the entrance to Kingston Harbor on a small piece of land that subsequently became known as Rackham's Quay. Every vessel entering or leaving the harbor passed the display. It was the standard deterrent of its era, applied consistently. Sir John Rackham was pronounced dead on November 18, 1720, at Port Royal, Jamaica. Cause of death, judicial hanging. His gibbeted body was displayed at the harbor entrance on the site that now carries his name. Executed at Nassau. Charles Vane was one of the few pirates of his era who looked at a royal pardon and refused it to his face, publicly, and sailed away. Vane had been operating out of Nassau in the Bahamas, which had become a semi-organized base for pirates in the years following the end of Queen Anne's War. In 1718, the Crown moved to reclaim the Bahamas. Woodes Rogers was appointed royal governor and arrived at Nassau Harbor with a fleet and an offer: accept the Act of Grace, take the pardon, and cease all piracy. Most of the Nassau pirates accepted. Vane did not. He sailed out of the harbor past Rogers' warships, reportedly firing a defiant gun as he went. Rogers declared him a pirate. The distinction had already been clear, but now it carried active Royal Navy attention. Vane continued operating in the Caribbean and along the North American coast. He was active, aggressive, and for a period difficult to catch. He made enemies among other pirates as well. A vote of his own crew eventually removed him from his captaincy for perceived cowardice in the face of a French warship he had declined to engage. He was put off his ship with a small crew in a captured sloop and left to continue on reduced terms. In late 1718, a hurricane destroyed his vessel. He was marooned on a small island in the Bay of Honduras. He survived there for weeks. A ship eventually passed. Its captain was a man named Holford, who knew Vane personally. Holford refused to take him aboard, or he reportedly did not want a man of Vane's reputation on his vessel. He left him on the island. A second vessel, whose crew did not recognize Vane, eventually retrieved him. At sea, someone aboard identified him. He was taken into custody and held. He was transported to Jamaica. The trial was not a lengthy affair. His history was documented. His defiance of Woodes Rogers was a matter of public record, and his continued piracy after refusing the pardon removed any legal ambiguity from the proceedings. He was convicted. Charles Vane was hanged at Gallows Point, Port Royal, Jamaica on March 29, 1721. His body was gibbeted at Gun Cay following his execution. Cause of death, judicial hanging. Drank himself to ruin. Henry Morgan died on August 25, 1688, at his home in Jamaica, of a wasting illness documented in detail by his own physician, a man named Dr. Hans Sloane, who would later become one of the most prominent figures in British medicine and eventually president of the Royal Society. Morgan had been, in his active years, the most formidable buccaneer commander of the 17th century. He was not a pirate in the legal sense during his major campaigns, but a privateer operating under commission from the governor of Jamaica. The distinction was meaningful to the crown, and largely without meaning to the Spanish colonists, whose settlements he raided. He moved through the Caribbean and Central America with a combination of organizational skill and a willingness to attempt objectives that others considered impossible. His most famous action was the sack of Panama City in 1671. He led a force across the Darien, through jungle and rivers without adequate supplies, and arrived at Panama weakened but functional. He burned the city. The raid was conducted under disputed authorization, the treaty that ended the war between England and Spain having been signed before he sailed, though he operated without knowledge of it. He was arrested and sent to England. He was never tried. He was instead knighted. He was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. He went back to the Caribbean as a colonial official. The later years undid what the earlier ones had built. Morgan drank heavily. This is not characterization, it is documented in contemporary accounts, most precisely in the records of Dr. Hans Sloane, who visited Morgan in the final period of his life and wrote down what he observed. Sloane described a man who was extremely thin. He described a distended abdomen, yellowed skin, and a body that showed the accumulated effects of long-term heavy alcohol consumption and decades of tropical disease. Sloane advised Morgan to change his habits. Morgan did not follow that advice. He had been dismissed as lieutenant governor in 1683. The years between that dismissal and his death in 1688 were spent on his Jamaican plantation. He had wealth, property, and no remaining function that matched what he had been. He died on August 25th, 1688. The location of his death is given variously in historical sources as his plantation near Port Maria or his home in Port Royal, and the record does not resolve this discrepancy cleanly. He was given a state funeral. Ships in the harbor fired a gun salute. He was buried at Palisado's cemetery near Port Royal. 4 years later, on June 7, 1692, an earthquake struck Jamaica. Much of Port Royal slid into the sea. It was one of the most destructive seismic events in Caribbean history. Morgan's tomb was among what the sea took. Now, Sir Henry Morgan died on August 25th, 1688. Cause of death: a wasting illness documented contemporaneously by his physician, with symptoms consistent with the long-term effects of heavy alcohol use. He was approximately 53 years old. His tomb no longer exists. Betrayed at sea. Samuel Bellamy, called Black Sam by those who sailed with him, died in the wreck of his flagship, the Whydah Galley, off Wellfleet, Massachusetts, on April 26, 1717. Of approximately 146 men aboard that night, 2 survived. Bellamy had been a pirate for less than a year when he died. In that time, he had captured more than 50 vessels. The Whydah was his prize ship, a former slave vessel he had taken in the spring of 1717, and refitted as a flagship. She was fast, well-armed, and loaded by April of that year with the accumulated plunder of more than 50 captured ships. Gold, silver, weapons, trade goods, and cargo from across the Atlantic were stowed in her hold. She was riding heavy in the water. Bellamy was sailing north along the New England coast on April 26th. His fleet was making progress. The weather changed. A nor'easter built off Cape Cod with the speed and violence that New England coastal storms can produce in the spring. Period accounts describe the storm as coming on hard and fast. The wind drove toward the shore. The Whydah was caught between the storm and the shoals off Wellfleet, a stretch of coast that offered no safe harbor and no room to maneuver a heavily loaded ship in deteriorating conditions. The Whydah struck the sandbar. Once she struck, the combination of the bar, the waves, the wind, and the weight of everything she was carrying worked against any possibility of recovery. The waves drove her apart. She sank in approximately 16 feet of water, close enough to shore that debris and bodies reached the beach within hours, but deep enough and violent enough that survival in the water that night was not a reasonable prospect. 102 bodies washed ashore in the days following the wreck. Local authorities collected what came in with the tide. 2 men were pulled from the water alive, Thomas Davis and John Julian. Everyone else, including Bellamy, was gone. The wreck site was not found for 267 years. In 1984, underwater explorer Barry Clifford and his team located the Whydah on the seafloor off Wellfleet. Excavation of the site confirmed its identity beyond any doubt. The ship's bell was recovered with the inscription, "The Whydah Galley, 1716," still legible on its surface. Artifacts, weapons, coins, and human remains were brought up from the wreck over subsequent years of excavation. Bellamy's individual remains have not been confirmed among those recovered. He was approximately 28 years old when the Whydah sank. Samuel Bellamy died on April 26th, 1717, in the wreck of the Whydah Galley off Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Cause of death: drowning or trauma sustained in the destruction of the vessel. He was approximately 28 years old. His body was never recovered and has never been individually identified. The bell of his ship sat on the ocean floor for 267 years, forgotten in prison. Stettebana, the man history has most consistently called the gentleman pirate, was hanged at White Point Garden in Charleston, South Carolina, on December 10th, 1718. He was approximately 29 to 30 years old. He had been a pirate for less than 2 years. Mbane came to piracy from a background that had nothing to do with the sea. He was a Barbadian landowner, a man of some wealth and standing, who had served as a military officer. He had no meaningful sailing experience when he purchased a vessel and commissioned it as a pirate ship. He paid his crew a wage rather than the standard pirate share arrangement, which was unusual enough that contemporaries noted it specifically. He had no obvious operational reason to become a pirate. Various period sources attributed his departure from his former life to unhappiness in his domestic circumstances, though the exact character of his motivations is not established as confirmed fact. He allied himself with Blackbeard, whose operational abilities were in an entirely different category. The alliance did not serve Bonnie well. Blackbeard took command of Bonnet's vessel and effectively ran the ship himself, leaving Bonnet as something close to a passenger on his own boat for a period. When the two eventually separated, Bonnet resumed raiding, operating under the alias Captain Thomas to obscure his identity. In September 1718, Colonel William Rhett, acting under orders from the governor of South Carolina, caught up with Bonnet at the mouth of the Cape Fear River. The engagement that followed lasted from morning into the afternoon. Rhett's vessels ran aground in the shallows. Bonnet's vessel, the Royal James, also ran aground. Both sides were stuck in the river mud, firing at each other at close range while waiting for the tide to change. Rhett's vessels came free first. Bonnet, with his vessel still grounded and his situation hopeless, surrendered. He was transported to Charleston. He was held in custody. He escaped before his trial, which was noted with considerable irritation by the colonial authorities. He was found and brought back. He was tried before Judge Nicholas Trott, whose sentencing remarks were extensive and included a sustained religious condemnation of Bonnet's choices and conduct. Contemporary accounts describe Bonnet as visibly distressed during this period, including during the proceedings and in the time between his recapture and his execution. He wrote letters seeking clemency. The letters were noted in period records and summarized in secondary sources, though their complete texts have not been consistently authenticated in primary form. The execution was carried out on December 10th, 1718, at White Point Garden. It was less than 3 weeks after Blackbeard had died at Ocracoke Inlet. That same season, Charleston hanged Bonnet and a large number of his crew members in a sequence of executions that effectively closed out the Carolina phase of the Golden Age of piracy. Stade Bonnet was pronounced dead on December 10th, 1718. Cause of death, judicial hanging. He was approximately 29 to 30 years old. Never left the island. François L'Ollonais, a French buccaneer who operated in the Caribbean in the 1660s and whose methods were documented as extreme even by the standards of a brutal era, disappeared from all surviving record around 1668. The only account of his death comes from Alexandre Exquemelin's Buccaneers of America, published in 1678. Exquemelin sailed with buccaneers of this period, and his work is the primary historical source for much of what is known about L'Ollonais. What follows is Exquemelin's account, framed throughout as such because no independent corroboration of the specific circumstances of his death has been found. L'Ollonais had operated with a particular ferocity in the Spanish Caribbean. Spanish colonial records identified him by name as a figure of significant threat. He raided Maracaibo and Gibraltar in present-day Venezuela in 1666, Roz taking both towns and extracting considerable plunder. His methods during these operations were recorded in Exquemelin's account, with specific detail that placed him apart from other buccaneers of the era in terms of violence directed at captives and prisoners. His final expedition aimed at the Spanish settlements of Honduras and the Central American coast. It was ambitious. It was also, by Exquemelin's account, a disaster from its early stages. His fleet encountered shallow waters that his ships could not navigate. The campaign against the settlements he targeted failed. His men began dying. Disease, starvation, and failed engagements reduced his force progressively. The ships were eventually lost or abandoned. The survivors moved inland on foot through the Darien region of present-day Panama. One of the most difficult environments in the Americas for a weakened and poorly supplied group of men to cross. Per Exquemelin's account, the remnants of the force were attacked by indigenous people in the Darien. L'Ollonais was captured. Exquemelin wrote that he was killed and consumed by his captors. Exquemelin was not present for these events. He did not witness them. His account was written a decade after they were said to have occurred, and it represents the sole surviving narrative of what happened in those final days. The Spanish, who monitored buccaneer activity closely enough that their records serve as a cross-reference for many events in this period, have no independent document confirming the specific manner of his death. What the record does confirm is that L'Ollonais ceased to appear in any subsequent account, Spanish or otherwise, after approximately 1668. François L'Ollonais died circa 1668 in the Darien region of present-day Panama. Cause of death, per the only surviving period account by Exquemelin, killed by indigenous people in the Darien. His age at death is not confirmed. No physical remains were ever identified or recovered. He vanished from the historical record completely, and Exquemelin's account is the only version of his end that survived. Gibbeted at Tilbury. William Fly was hanged at Boston Harbor on July 12th, 1726. His entire career as a pirate had lasted approximately 6 weeks. He showed contempt for the proceedings against him from the beginning and did not adjust that position at the end. Fly had been a sailor before he became anything else. In May 1726, he was aboard a slave ship called the Elizabeth, serving under a captain named John Green. What happened next is documented in the records of the trial, and in the published account of Cotton Mather, the prominent Puritan minister who visited Fly in prison, and later wrote about those conversations. See, Fly and a portion of of the Elizabeth's crew mutinied. Captain Green and the first mate were killed during the mutiny and thrown overboard. Fly took command of the vessel. He operated in the Atlantic for approximately 6 weeks. He did not build a large fleet, he did not accumulate a significant record of captures. The career was short, and its end was determined not by a naval pursuit but by his own crew. The men who sailed under Fly became dissatisfied with his command. They organized among themselves and overpowered him. They brought him to port. He was handed to colonial authorities in Boston. Cotton Mather visited him in prison on multiple occasions. Mather's objective, as it had been in previous cases of condemned men, was to encourage an expression of repentance that could serve a moral and religious purpose in the published account he intended to write. Fly did not cooperate with this objective. According to Mather's published account, Fly was consistent and unapologetic throughout their conversations. He did not express the remorse that Mather sought. He maintained, by Mather's account, an attitude of contempt for the way the proceedings were being handled. He was convicted of piracy and the murders committed during the mutiny aboard the Elizabeth. On July 12, 1726, Fly was brought to the gallows at Boston Harbor. According to Cotton Mather's account, Fly found fault with the hangman's knot. He took the rope and adjusted it himself. He reportedly told the hangman he did not know his work properly. All details of Fly's conduct at the gallows come from Mather's published account, written from Mather's perspective and with Mather's intended audience and purpose in mind, and are framed here accordingly. He was hanged. His body was then gibbeted at the entrance to Boston Harbor. The gibbet display was the same deterrent that had been used at river entrances and harbor mouths throughout the era, from Tilbury Point on the Thames to the quay outside Kingston. The body was mounted in iron and positioned where sailors would see it coming in and going out. Historians have noted Fly's case as occurring at the practical end of what is referred to as the golden age of piracy. The major figures of the era, Blackbeard, Roberts, Vane, Rackham, Bellamy, Bonnet, were already dead by 1726. The Royal Navy's sustained campaign against piracy in the Atlantic and Caribbean had been largely effective. What had once been a sprawling decentralized network of pirate operations across 2 oceans had been reduced by years of pursuit, trial, and execution to isolated individuals operating on diminished margins. The infrastructure that had allowed pirates to sell prizes, recruit freely, and shelter in sympathetic ports had been dismantled. The men who remained were not successors to Bellamy or Roberts, so much as stragglers in a fight that had already been decided. Fly operated in the closing chapter of a period that had already, for the most part, run its course. He had no flagship, no fleet, no loyal shore connections, and no patron in any colonial administration willing to look the other way. The conditions that had made the Golden Age possible, the post-war surplus of unemployed sailors, the weak governance of Atlantic shipping lanes, the porous colonial administration of the Caribbean and North American coast, had been steadily closed off. By 1726, the tools of piracy survival had been largely taken away. What remained was the rope and the gibbet, which were applied to Fly as they had been applied to every significant pirate who preceded him in the final decade of the era. Cotton Mather published his account. Fly's body was displayed at the harbor entrance, and the age that had produced Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, Bartholomew Roberts, Calico Jack, Charles Vane, Henry Morgan, Samuel Bellamy, Stedda, Bonnet, and Francois l'Olonnais came without ceremony to its end. William Fly was pronounced dead on July 12, 1726, at Boston Harbor, Massachusetts. Cause of death, judicial hanging. He was one of the last pirates executed in New England in the final years of the golden age of piracy. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.